following is a special presentation of WAAY 31 News. What started as a dream
It was always in his vision for humans to go to Mars.
turned into a concept before eventually becoming reality. Years of hard work and dedication,
Never off the clock, 24/7, 365.
laying the foundation for progress. All with one main goal in mind:
It's going to take humans to Mars one of these days.
NASA and humanity taking the next giant leap.
3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis I. We rise together back to the moon and beyond.
The most powerful rocket ever built, blasting off into space. The thunderous roar, a powerful symbol of the strength and the future of humankind. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm WAAY 31 News anchor Dan Schaefer at the Kennedy Space Center, America's spaceport here in Florida. Thank you for joining us on such an historic day for U.S. space exploration. The SLS rocket lifting off, the culmination of more than a decade of hard work by the dedicated men and women of NASA and their private partners, those corporations, many of whom have a footprint right there in North Alabama, all coming together to make this Artemis program possible. Over the next hour, we'll introduce you to the men and women at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, responsible for the development of the hardware, the mission, and management of the Artemis program. We'll also take a trip to Johnson Space Center in Houston to learn the team's goals over the next 25 days of this mission and how it's preparing astronauts to live and work on the moon for months and years. More importantly, we want to give you a sense of why we're going to the moon. In the 50 years since the Apollo 17 crew returned to Earth, we have learned a lot more about the lunar surface and what it has to offer and how we can use those resources to venture deeper into space. And really, that is what the Artemis program is all about.
Artemis, goddess of the moon, twin sister of Apollo. In the 1960s and 70s, the Apollo moon landings astounded the world. Those missions laid the groundwork for a new generation of explorers, what NASA now calls the Artemis generation. Americans are going back to the moon and beyond, not just for a few days, but to stay.
There's a human spirit that says we need to explore. It's just in our blood.
For modern pioneers like NASA's Gary Lyles, what's happening right now was inevitable. Humans taking the first steps toward establishing a long-term presence on the moon to take the next giant leap to another planet. He and his team at Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville are credited with making it possible, designing the most powerful rocket ever built, the Space Launch System, or SLS.
Oh yeah, this is just the beginning. Its purpose is much bigger than that first launch. Its purpose is a capability that's going to take humans back to the moon. It's going to take humans to Mars one of these days.
Artemis missions begin with the SLS. The new heavy lift rocket will transport supplies, equipment, parts, and people to the lunar surface. Who those people are is also a key part of the missions. The Artemis program will land the first woman and first person of color on the moon.
Apollo was the male. So with our Artemis mission, having it such that it is the first woman and the next person of color, hopefully that inspires everyone, that everyone can see themselves doing a job, going to the moon, being an astronaut, anything that they challenge and set their dreams for, that it's there. Somebody's got to be first somewhere.
Other milestones and goals of Artemis include learning everything we can about the moon, what it has to offer, what it means to live and work on another celestial body for a long time, leading to the ultimate goal of extending the human reach to our neighboring planet.
All of that has to be known before you take on something like Mars. The moon is still the next step, and I think the timing is right because we now have developed that capability to actually go and live on the moon. You know, Mars maybe is not the end either. I'm a thorough believer that humans will always be reaching further and further out and exploring, and space is the next exploration ground.
With Apollo, America sent and returned humans to and from the moon 6 times between 1969 and 1972. The plans now are much more ambitious. So how will NASA accomplish them? Well, it won't be easy. But as they like to say around here, history is made by those who dare to dream big and do the impossible.
We want to be the leaders. We want to continue to lead in space.
The entire Artemis program is managed through Huntsville's Marshall Space Flight Center. Center Director Jody Singer is singularly focused on seeing it through.
I think there is still that pressure to continue to be a nation that leads. And I think our pride in being able to return back to the moon where we haven't been in over 50 years is an accomplishment, and Artemis I is the first start of that.
Singer's team is responsible for integrating design elements not only from NASA engineers, but from commercial partners from every state and several countries around the world who all have a role in bringing about mission success. Every Artemis mission begins with the SLS, the most powerful rocket ever built. But there's a lot more that goes into the program, and it all starts before the rocket even leaves the pad. Exploration Ground Systems is the crew responsible for developing and operating the facilities and the systems to assemble, transport, and launch the SLS. Every facility at NASA's Kennedy Space Center has been modified to support this historic program, from the vehicle assembly building to the crawler that takes the rocket to the launch pad and even the pad itself. Orion is a brand new next-generation crew capsule. The Orion spacecraft, built by Lockheed Martin, is capable of sustaining astronauts for weeks in outer space and bringing them safely back to Earth. This Artemis I flight will examine its abilities.
We will test out the Orion capsule and all of its systems around the moon, and then comes back in at about 25,000 miles an hour to really test out the heat shields.
To explore the moon for any length of time, astronauts will need to live there for weeks, perhaps months at a time. NASA developed a new lunar orbiting outpost called Gateway that will serve as a hub between Earth, the Moon, Mars, and beyond. Orion will dock at and deliver astronauts and supplies to Gateway. Similar to the current International Space Station, Gateway will provide everything needed to live and work in lunar orbit. And it's designed to grow with the increasingly complex missions of the Artemis program. A new way of landing on the moon is being developed in Huntsville. The human landing system will launch astronauts from Gateway to the lunar surface and back. Astronauts will also have a place to live and work on the moon's surface, the Artemis Base Camp. It'll afford Artemis astronauts the ability to explore and study more of the moon than ever before, and to test out equipment and procedures for future missions to Mars.
Each of these elements is crucial to the success of the overall Artemis program, which is why we're going to dive deeper into each one of them. We begin with NASA's Space Launch System. Now, all of us here in North Alabama stand a lot taller today thanks to the work the men and women here at Marshall Space Flight Center have done to turn the idea of this rocket into reality.
This team has worked really hard and never off the clock, 24/7, 365.
A decade of design and development, extensive testing and certification. The Super Heavy Lift Space Launch System, or SLS, is the only rocket on Earth capable of accomplishing the goals set forth by NASA's Artemis program.
We're the only vehicle right now that exists that can launch the Orion.
Singer has been a part of the development of the SLS since its inception.
I've got to say, space exploration begins in Alabama, and I'm very proud of it.
First as Deputy Program Manager, then as Center Director at Marshall, she is in charge of more than 3,000 civil servants and contractors working on this next-gen American-made heavy lift rocket.
Our team were responsible for the solid rocket boosters, the engines, the core stage. In addition to that, the stage adapter.
Singer calls the Artemis missions a national priority. Indeed, the SLS is made up of parts from every state in the U.S. and from countries all over the world.
That's a huge team of some of the smartest people I have ever worked with.
Chief NASA SLS engineer John Blevins has dedicated his professional career to seeing the SLS fly. He says this rocket has everything it needs to do the job and nothing it doesn't.
What's elegant about this machine is that it is complex, but only as complex as it needs to be.
Blevins calls it smart engineering. He didn't start from scratch with SLS. The rocket is part proven, part new, and part legacy technology.
We take something that exists as a piece of machinery, but we use it differently in a lot of cases. That's just smart engineering, right? Use what you got, use what your industrial base can build, and make sure that you succeed at the mission.
It starts with an all-new 212-foot-tall core stage developed by Boeing, the tallest core stage NASA has ever built. Inside are the rocket's flight controls and computer, and 2.3 million pounds of fuel. The 4 RS-25 engines are repurposed space shuttle engines, but tuned up and supercharged for the SLS. The sheer weight of the space launch system, nearly 6 million pounds when fueled, requires tremendous thrust to escape Earth's gravity. 75% of that thrust is provided by 2 Northrop Grumman solid rocket boosters mounted on either side of the core stage. 2 minutes after launch, the SRBs are spent and jettisoned. Fast forward to 8 minutes, and the core stage fuel is used up, and the second stage separates. That second stage includes the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, built by United Launch Alliance. It gives Orion multiple pushes into Earth orbit and then towards the Moon. Connecting the core stage to the upper stage are various adapters. Move up to the top of the rocket and you'll find the Orion crew capsule, which, at liftoff, is enclosed by the launch abort system. There it is, 322 feet of thundering Alabama-engineered Mega Moon rocket.
I think it's a great machine. I think what you're going to see is that it really opens up opportunities that we haven't even yet thought of to use this machine for science and exploration. I just think there's a lot of great things we're going to be able to do with this.
The Artemis I mission is meant to push the Orion spacecraft to its limit. When we come back, we'll take a look inside the capsule, now making its first trek around the Moon and back. Welcome back to Kennedy Space Center. As with any mission, NASA has primary objectives it hopes to accomplish with Artemis I. On this mission, the top priority is making sure the Orion spacecraft functions properly and will keep a crew safe on future missions from liftoff to splashdown.
The Orion spacecraft is specifically designed to carry astronauts to deep space. In fact, it's currently the only spacecraft that can do so.
This is a training mock-up of the actual Orion spacecraft. This is the tip top of the rocket where the astronauts sit.
It's made up of 3 main elements. First, the crew module, where astronauts will live and work. Next, the launch abort system, developed by Northrop Grumman. Activated within milliseconds, it can pull the spacecraft and crew to safety in the event of an emergency during launch or ascent into orbit. Finally, the service module. Created in collaboration with the European Space Agency, it provides power, propulsion, and thermal control.
It's a dress rehearsal, right? This whole mission is a dress rehearsal for when we have crew members on board the Orion space capsule.
The number 1 priority, will it survive re-entry?
Orion will hit the Earth's atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour. It's faster and hotter than any other human-rated spacecraft before. So a whole new heat shield had to be developed to protect the spacecraft.
Definitely the heat shield is number 1. We have done a lot of work over the years in the development of this heat shield. It's the largest of its kind. It's 16 feet in diameter, and in comparison with Apollo is about 12 feet in diameter.
There's no one who knows more about how to protect astronauts from temperatures half as hot as the surface of the sun than the spacecraft's chief engineer, Ronnie Backus.
When we talk about the heat shield, it's primarily the dish here on the bottom, and so there is a seam. It's probably close to where we've got it on this mock-up, that wraps around the shoulder and goes all the way around to the other side. So it's basically like a big dish.
That dish has a titanium skeleton and carbon fiber skin with more than 180 precision-engineered blocks of a material called Avcoat bonded to it.
At most, it's a little bit less than 3 inches thick, so about like that. And so on one side, you mentioned the surface temperature, that gets up to 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit at that point. but it's designed to only ever get no warmer than 500 degrees, just a couple of inches away.
Like many other parts of the Artemis I mission, this coating shares a heritage that goes all the way back to Apollo, with modern improvements in design and manufacturing.
It's an amazing material. You're never more than just a few hundred degrees or so on the backside, where this material is bonded to the structure so that we keep the crew and the spacecraft, and most importantly the crew, safe and protected.
This isn't the first test for Orion. Its design went through multiple experiments to test its function. Everything from dropping it only a few feet to sending it into orbit for hours.
And liftoff.
All with the goal of making it as safe as it can be.
We've incorporated those modifications in for Artemis I that we will be demonstrating for the first time.
The mission will also test the spacecraft's navigation and communication systems beyond the range of GPS, above communication satellites in Earth orbit.
We're really just making sure that it's on track and it's where we expect it to be, and it's going where we want it to go.
Even after the initial push off Earth's surface, Orion can't make the journey to the moon on its own. That's where the interim cryogenic propulsion stage comes in. Built by ULA in Decatur in collaboration with Boeing, the ICPS will give Orion the big push it needs to fly beyond the moon. A lot of hands all working together for a common goal.
It's a huge collaboration across the country, and it's just incredible because just to see so many people working together towards one goal is there's something really beautiful about that, and bringing people together to essentially expand humanity's presence in space is just such a beautiful message, and I'm really excited to be a part of a program like this.
As with all tests, especially one like this, there is always the reality of the unknown. But for NASA, the time and effort they've put into the Orion spacecraft helps put everyone at ease.
You know, a lot of confidence in the design. I think, we will learn, obviously, it's in the flight test, how did our models predict accurately, where we're getting the peak heating or the peak heat flux, those things, but I don't have concerns about not getting the vehicle back.
Another main objective of the Artemis I mission is to accomplish other objectives. Now, there are two critical pieces of the SLS, both of them stage adapters that were built from the ground up right here in our own backyard. Both of them serving key and multiple functions during this mission.
At 5 feet tall and 18 feet in diameter, the Orion stage adapter is just one of the many puzzle pieces helping make Artemis I possible. What makes each part of a puzzle so important? Its shape and size, and that was exactly the case for this adapter.
The interim cryogenic propulsion stage built by United Launch Alliance in Decatur, Alabama here, that part is part of their rocket family of the Delta stage. And so we took that upper stage, we decided we wanted to use that for part of this mission, for mission success, until we could build a different upper stage, and so that diameter existed. The Orion program came from the former program of Constellation, and so it had a diameter that existed, and so you need to put those two parts together. Better than changing either of those parts would be to put an adapter between those. That adapter has to be strong, it has to handle the loads. It provided an opportunity to put these secondary payloads and other things in, but that's the history of why we have that adapter in.
While linking the two components is its main purpose, the adapter, built by Teledyne Brown Engineering at Marshall Space Flight Center, has several other functions. It creates a barrier to prevent gases generated during launch from entering Orion. It also wasn't empty. Hitching a ride inside were 10 small spacecraft.
It gave us a great opportunity to fly secondary payloads, which are small CubeSats in this case.
The CubeSats aren't much larger than a shoebox and weigh about 25 pounds each. These low-cost science and technology experiments will help pave the way for future human exploration in deep space. One, created in Huntsville, will study asteroids that are close to Earth. NEA Scout, as it's called, will give us a better understanding of the asteroids and the dangers they pose.
The Near-Earth Asteroid Scout is a solar cell technology demonstrator. So out of a shoebox-sized spacecraft, we're going to deploy an 80 square meter solar cell that is going to test this new propulsion technology to use solar particles to push the spacecraft out to an asteroid. And then we will use our cameras and instruments to study that asteroid and the makeup of it.
That solar sail, by the way, was developed by another Huntsville company, Nexolve. The company also created the solar shield being used to protect the Webb Space Telescope right now. NEA Scout's journey will take about 2 years, leaving it 93 million miles from Earth when it reaches the targeted asteroid. Other CubeSats will study the moon and radiation.
We've got some that are flying to the moon. One could be the smallest rocket to ever land on the moon, for instance. There's some that are going out to deep space to try to be the farthest CubeSat that's to go into deep space. So just a lot of cool science and technology that they're trying to demonstrate, all packed into a little bit of CubeSat.
As for the stage adapter, its role in the Artemis program comes with an expiration date.
This is only needed for the first 3 flights because on the 4th flight, we'll have a much larger upper stage that will be even more capable, and it will use a different type of method to connect to the Orion.
The future of space travel won't see gender or race. Coming up, we'll dive deeper into NASA's efforts to break barriers through the Artemis program. After walking on the moon 53 years ago, a reporter asked Neil Armstrong if he thought there would ever be an opportunity for a woman to become a U.S. astronaut. His simple answer, gosh, I hope so. Almost 15 years later, in 1983, Sally Ride became the first American woman in space. Guy Bluford became the first African American that same year. In 1992, North Alabama's own Dr. Mae Jemison became the first African American woman in space. Last year, NASA announced a slight update to its stated Artemis goals. Instead of the first woman and next man on the moon, the new focus would be the first woman and first person of color on the moon.
One of those chosen as an Artemis astronaut, Victor Glover. This almost 10-year NASA veteran and former Navy pilot was 2 years old in 1978 when NASA accepted its first women and minorities into the astronaut corps.
It's important to recognize the work and the effort that has been put in to make our astronaut corps look the way that it is.
While NASA was opening up more technical and support jobs to people of color in the 1960s, the public faces of the space agency, the astronauts themselves, did not reflect the diversity of the country. Glover is proud of his agency's efforts to change that.
You look at now versus the Mercury 7. My class was 8 people, and you look, not only was there ethnic diversity, but it was 4 men and 4 women. I'm really proud of that, and that was intentional.
It's a point of pride for thousands of employees at NASA and its contractors around the country, committing to land the first woman and first person of color on the moon, sure to spark the dreams and aspirations of young students everywhere.
I think it's going to really promote, more minorities in STEM, and that's going to encourage younger people to, get into STEM, because I think the reason that they don't really get into STEM is because they don't see themselves there. And once you see yourself in a position, then you're like, oh, I can do that.
For Dr. Ruth Jones, who works on astronaut life support systems at Marshall Space Flight Center, that moment came when she was a young college student in Arkansas.
So basically who I looked up to at that point was Mae Jemison when she flew into space in 1992.
For Glover, his goal is to always inspire future generations.
We still have to continue to push to make sure that we're not only exploring for all people, but we're exploring by all people. We have an astronaut corps that can support that, and it's just the right thing to do, and I'm very happy about that.
Glover definitely has a gleam in his eye when he starts talking about humans going back to the moon. He doesn't have to be the first person of color there. He just hopes to get there one day.
That's what we're here for. All of us are here to explore space. And so, yes, I came to NASA because my dream was to walk on and work on the moon. But I think every astronaut should want to do whatever the work is. The next mission going up to space, all of us should want to be on that one. And so that's the same way that I feel. I want to be a part of whatever the mission is now and help do the work.
NASA broke another barrier during today's launch. This is the space agency's first liftoff under a female launch director, with Charlie Blackwell Thompson at the helm. As Artemis launches become more frequent in the coming years, a key part of the program's success is a space station orbiting the moon called Gateway. Parts of Gateway are being designed and built by NASA and its international partners around the world right now. We went to Johnson Space Center to give you a closer look at some of the work.
Johnson maintains full-scale mock-ups of various space vehicles. Some are set up temporarily in hot, humid warehouses. Such is the case for a mock-up of one of the modules of a lunar outpost.
Unlike Apollo, Artemis astronauts will spend a lot more than just a few days at the moon. Under construction right now is a new lunar orbiting space station called Gateway. The astronauts' home aboard Gateway is this module. This is the Habitation and Logistics Outpost, or HALO.
Looks small? Well, it is. And this is just the frame. Imagine it filled with equipment and supplies. Want to be an Artemis astronaut? Big respect, but itty-bitty living space.
The way I equate HALO is it's not, a lot of people are used to the International Space Station, which is, you know, the size of a 5-bedroom house, but it's also really, really close to home, you know, just up in low Earth orbit.
Physics says it doesn't make sense to push something that large to a lunar orbit, 1,000 times farther into space than the ISS.
Mass is critical driver in that equation, so the reality is you really need to build what you need to do the mission, and that's what really HALO's all about.
The good news for the astronauts, they won't be stuck aboard HALO. Gateway is what its name implies, a gateway to the lunar surface.
Obviously, when the crew is on board, you've got the essentials of life support equipment, because really when the crew shows up, their immediate plan is to prepare to go to the surface of the moon.
Gateway is designed as a platform, a stop for astronauts when traveling to and from the lunar surface. Gateway will follow a highly elliptical, oval-shaped orbit. At its closest, the space station will fly to about 1,000 miles from the lunar North Pole. But then it swings widely to a point 43,000 miles above the moon's South Pole. Now, there are several reasons for this unusual 7-day orbit. First, it puts Gateway in a sweet spot, balancing between Earth and the moon's gravitational pulls. It allows Gateway to remain in lunar orbit for years, with very little fuel needed for adjustments. This polar orbit allows for minimal communication blackout with Earth, so when astronauts aren't on board, scientists on Earth will still be able to perform experiments, housekeeping functions, even maintenance with the help of robotics. Finally, the orbit provides astronauts and spacecraft access to other landing sites, in addition to the moon's South Pole. The first pieces to go up will be the power and habitation modules. Yes, cramped quarters at first.
With respect to the Gateway, this is the first habitable element, but the next piece coming up, the international habitat, will have more room and it'll be more habitable for the crew, so they've got more area to stretch out and do kind of stuff.
While NASA prepares its next orbiting laboratory, Marshall Space Flight Center continues to be the heartbeat for research aboard the ISS. The team here at the Payload Operations Center coordinates all of the U.S. scientific and commercial experiments aboard the space station.
The science that we're doing, learning how to grow food, learning how the human body reacts for these long duration space flights, learning how to take care of the crew for those missions is all critical to be able to achieve not only longer stays on the surface of the moon, but also the trip to Mars.
Right now, NASA is working to make sure the Artemis astronauts are ready for life on the moon and Mars. In a few minutes, we'll give you a behind-the-scenes look at their training. Welcome back. For future Artemis missions, the technology to land humans back on the moon is called the Human Landing System. Back in 2019, Marshall Space Flight Center was chosen to lead that program, spearheading its development. Designs from 3 companies were chosen as finalists. Those include Blue Origin, Dynetics, and finally SpaceX, who walked away with the victory. The company's design was based around its Starship. The selection comes with a milestone-based contract and a $2.89 billion price tag. Everything NASA does is with the safety of the crew in mind. The team in charge of training astronauts is at Johnson Space Center. For one of the astronauts we met, her dreams of flying in space were fostered by a trip to Huntsville years ago.
I did go to space camp in Huntsville, Alabama.
Before being selected as an Artemis astronaut, Jasmine Mogbelli visited the Rocket City to try her hand at being an astronaut.
It was a great experience. Back then it was during the shuttle era, so we did a lot of practice shuttle simulations, and we'd rotate through the different roles, you know, pilot, commander, payload specialist, and work through. They'd give us emergencies, and we'd have to work through them.
Fast forward through an aerospace engineering degree from MIT, U.S. Naval Test Pilot School, 3 tours in Afghanistan as a decorated Marine Corps attack helicopter pilot, and Mogbelli is now in line to one day walk on the moon.
Jasmine Mogbelli. Well, I've wanted to do this pretty much my whole life. When I first got the phone call, my hands were shaking. I was pretty excited.
She's now based here at Johnson Space Center, home to Mission Control and the Astronaut Training Program. As they like to say, giant leaps start here.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Full-scale, exact replicas of space vehicles are set up to simulate as closely as possible what astronauts will have to deal with in space. Some of the most sophisticated virtual reality simulators in the world are at astronauts' disposal.
Virtual reality is really important because it helps put together in an immersive environment to replicate our actual mission environment as close as we can.
Need to learn to drive a rover at the moon's south pole? This simulator adjusts the lighting and terrain to exactly match the year, day, time, and location.
In our other facilities, it's really hard to put that whole big picture together for the crew members to actually see the kinds of visual stimulations that they will have.
I had a chance to try my hand at docking a spacecraft at the ISS. Not bad, but I don't think they're ready to hand me the controls just yet. VR can only go so far, though. For a truly immersive experience, astronauts have to take the plunge, literally.
What does it feel like to be weightless, to work in a weightless environment? Well, it turns out the closest we can get here on Earth is floating underwater. So NASA built this massive pool, one of the largest in the world. It's called the Neutral Buoyancy Laboratory. It's 202 feet long, 102 feet wide, 40 feet deep, holds 6.2 million gallons of water. It's big enough to sink mock-ups of modules of the International Space Station. On the other side of the pool, for Artemis, NASA's actually recreating the lunar surface with sand and rocks so that Artemis astronauts can practice walking on the moon.
We have been training crew in a microgravity environment since we started building space station, since actually we've been flying shuttle. So now we're getting ready to send crew to the moon, and we need to train them how to move in their spacesuit, how to use geology tools, and so we're building this environment here in the pool to help facilitate that.
They try to anticipate everything an astronaut might encounter.
You know, the moon is not a flat surface. They may be going uphill, they may be going downhill, cross slope, so we need to train the astronauts for all of that. One of the main goals of Artemis is to do geology and understand the scientific history of the moon. And so we put these in the pool to help the astronauts learn how to describe the context and the size, shape, all the things that the scientists down on the Earth need to be able to understand the samples that they're taking.
Artemis astronaut Mogbelli can't wait to be a part of it all.
I would love to walk on the moon and look back at the planet Earth. That would be something.
Mogbelli has already been selected as commander of the NASA SpaceX Crew 7 mission to the ISS next year. One of the final pieces of the program is called the Artemis Base Camp. The concept is a place for astronauts to live and work on the moon. It's broken into 3 parts: a rover to take astronauts around the site, a mobile home for long trips, and a cabin that could hold 4 crew members. Marshall Space Flight Center is playing a major role in preparations for the site.
And we're starting to develop the next generation of those systems to be used on those long duration missions on the surface of the moon. So there's a lot going on in this campaign, and Marshall is front and center in all of it.
While the goals of Artemis are the moon and Mars, all missions start right here on Earth. When we come back, we'll take a look at the crew and the technology that make reaching for the stars a reality. Each Artemis mission starts long before a rocket's engines fire. Here at Kennedy Space Center, the teams are tasked with connecting all the dots to make a trip to the moon or Mars possible.
For the Exploration Ground Systems team, a little more than 4 miles is the difference between success and failure. The iconic Vehicle Assembly Building, or VAB, is the central hub of the spaceport. There, rockets are assembled, or stacked, as crews like to say, and from there, the massive Crawler Transporter 2 moves the Mega Moon rocket and mobile launcher to and from the launch pad. That crawler, which weighs more than 6 million pounds on its own and hits a top speed of 1 mile per hour while loaded, relies on the Tennessee Valley for a successful trip. It rides on an 8-inch bed of Tennessee River rock, which rolls under pressure instead of braking and causing sparks. For the team at Kennedy, the daring trip to Launch Pad 39B has become somewhat of a common occurrence. Technical issues foiled several attempts at the last test before launch, known as the wet dress rehearsal.
And comparing it to what we did in the Apollo days is important too. So it took Apollo
numerous months and 11 different attempts to get through a wet dress rehearsal. We did the same thing with 4 attempts. I know a lot of people thought, goodness gracious, we didn't get it all done the first time. That's okay.
The issues didn't stop there. Leaks caused 2 launch attempts to be scrubbed.
We're learning the vehicle. We're learning how to operate the vehicle, and we are learning all of the things required to get us ready to fly.
Then, Mother Nature stepped in. First, Hurricane Ian forced the rocket back into the VAB. After outlasting that storm and moving back to the launch pad, Hurricane Nicole posed yet another threat. NASA officials deciding to leave the more than $4 billion rocket on the pad to ride out the 80-plus mile-per-hour wind gusts just below the rocket's design limits. But history can't be made without taking a few risks.
We've talked about this mission being risky, but we're going to take the risks that make sense.
The risks paying off. But the job isn't over yet. The landing and recovery team is responsible for safely recovering the Orion capsule and its future crews. From start to finish, Exploration Ground Systems makes Kennedy Space Center somewhere for Artemis I and the rest of the missions to call home.
NASA isn't taking on this mighty feat alone. International partners are playing a key role in creating a sustainable presence on the Moon before taking that next giant leap to Mars. Nearly a dozen countries signed the Artemis Accords. They set a common vision among the countries through principles, guidelines, and best practices. Many are rooted in the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. At their core is peace and transparency among nations. As we near the end of our special presentation, we recognize this is a vision decades in the making. Wernher von Braun didn't live to see this day, but even a half-century ago, he envisioned how this would all play out. Welcome back to the Kennedy Space Center. We want to take a moment to honor the man and his team who saw this day coming 60 years ago. Wernher von Braun and the Apollo generation blazed a trail that the Artemis generation will now follow all the way to Mars.
Well, I think the next target for men, other than activities, of course, in low Earth orbit, of which there will be many, will probably be Mars.
Prophetic words from the father of the U.S. space program, Wernher von Braun, spoken to students at UAH in 1975, just a few years after Apollo 17, the final mission to the Moon. Of course, during that same appearance, he also predicted the first baby would be born on the Moon by the year 2000. So he didn't nail it every time, but he knew we would be heading to the Red Planet.
Mars was the focus for von Braun, I think.
Gary Lyles, the architect of the SLS, knows he owes a lot to the vision of von Braun, whose team pulled off one of the greatest feats of the 20th century, landing humans on the Moon and returning them to Earth.
We weren't quite ready to stay on the Moon at that point. We, I believe, hurried to the Moon, and it was a great accomplishment. But what humans really needed to do was learn to live in space.
We accomplished that with the International Space Station, built using a reusable shuttle. All concepts von Braun was talking about as far back as the 1950s in this Walt Disney movie about space travel.
This entire space station will have to be prefabricated and tested on the ground. After dismantling, it will be transported in pieces up to the orbit.
He proposed that people live and work in space and be able to go there relatively cheaply before we took on the Mars concept. But von Braun was thinking about a bigger rocket even than Saturn V back then for Mars missions. It was always in his vision for humans to go to Mars.
We always seem to hear from the first man on the Moon when we talk about exploring space.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
But what about the next giant leap, the last man on the Moon? Astronaut Gene Cernan had something to say about that. He challenged future generations to take up the mantle of von Braun's Apollo missions.
What I believe history will record that America's challenge of today has forged man's destiny of tomorrow. We leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and in hope. for all mankind.
And now, we're on our way. The new Artemis generation. NASA's space launch system, we are starting down that path. First, back to the moon, then on to the planets beyond. According to Von Braun, our very survival might depend on it.
Space flight for the first time gives mankind a chance to become immortal. In other words, once this Earth will no longer be able to support life, we can immigrate and go to other places that are better suited for the support of life.
Thank you for joining us for our coverage of the Artemis I launch, the first step on an ambitious journey to first return humans to the moon, then on to Mars and beyond. And a special thanks to everyone here at Kennedy, at Johnson, and at Marshall Space Flight Centers for sharing their passion about this program with us and inspiring the next generation, the Artemis generation, that will take that next giant leap for humankind.
Thank you for watching this special presentation of WAAY 31 News. For more than 60 years, North Alabama has turned to WAAY 31 for trusted news, weather, and information. Coverage you can count on air, online, on your phone. WAAY 31.